Welcome everyone to our panel, Beliefs, Bodies, and Sexuality. My name is Dr. Jasmine Noelle Yarish, and I will be chairing and serving as discussant for this panel. We're going to actually follow the order that's in the program. So we're going to actually start with Maya. So Maya, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mayannah Beauvoir. I go by Maya, and I'm a first-year master's student in the Pan-African Studies program at Syracuse University. My research focus is on Black feminist geographies, feminist geography, Black feminist perspectives on space and place, as well as transnational feminist inquiries in the Pan-African world. So the paper that I will be presenting today is actually a paper that I wrote for a political economies course in the Pan-African Studies department here. And it is concerned with Afro-Latin politics in the Pan-African world concerning reproductive rights and autonomy. So the title of my paper is called Feminismo de Base, Abortion Ban in Honduras from a Pan-African Perspective. And this paper was written for a lot of different reasons, partially because I am of Honduran heritage. So this topic was very interesting to me for that reason, but also because I've always been very fascinated by reproductive autonomy by third world women and the grassroots movements that have followed it. So this also came as a response to the most recent abortion ban of 2021, or one would say the constitutional lock on abortions and other reproductive access in Honduras. So before I begin and kind of take you through my paper, some of the research questions that I wanted to answer were, what are the trends of the region of Latin America that can predict the future of sexual politics in Honduras? What will the future of Honduras look like with Xiomara Castro's presidential election? And how do the grassroots feminist organizations in Honduras resist? And finally, what is the Native Indigenous Garifuna response to the constitutional law? So in January of 2021, the Honduran government made the landmark decision that would have devastating impacts for women for decades to come. And the result was a constitutional lock on the country's abortion ban. Although abortion was banned in the country previously under certain circumstances, it now will be nearly impossible to reverse. It would need 96 out of 128 votes to be able to reform that. And the movement for reproductive freedom in Honduras is being led by grassroots feminist organizations. And it's kind of following a similar trend to other places like Argentina. And this amendment has very serious impacts for women of color, poor women, and the indigenous Garifuna population. And even though it's not often recognized past the greater mestizo population of Honduras, there is a very large population of Afro-Latinos and indigenous people. And what often happens when countries like this crack down on abortion law, the women in the country are more at risk for clandestine abortions because they have unequal access to medical interventions in cases of emergencies. And what my paper hopes to do is bring the voices of these women from margin to center. So using a Pan-African and transnational feminist lens, I'm seeking to understand what are the experiences of grassroots organizations of people of color's access to reproductive freedom in Honduras. So I started off kind of assessing the separation of church and state across colonialism in Honduras and across the Latin American region. And even though this area, Central America in general, is recognized as a secular area and Honduras is a secular country, there are clear tensions between church and state and a delicate balance between church and state. And that has continued to impact the two dominant parties in the country, which are the Liberal Party and the National Party. The National Party has been ruling Honduras for many years and has not necessarily recognized a difference in church and state. So for the trends of the region, it's not the only Latin American country that has criminalized abortion. Honduras, along with the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Haiti, and Nicaragua have all criminalized abortion with no explicit legal exceptions. In other parts of Latin America, it's permitted in order to save the life of a woman or to preserve her physical or mental health or for socioeconomic reasons. The only countries that permit abortion with no restriction are Cuba, Guyana, Puerto Rico, and Uruguay. So despite there being a serious push for abortions by the population of Honduras, there is still the strong opponent of the Roman Catholic Church and conservative politicians, and also patriarchal power structures that have tried to stop feminist activism in the country. So throughout my paper, I've also utilized a lot of resources from the Honduran government as well as the UN, trying to understand what the gender policy and experiences of women are in Honduras in general. And for the most part, the UN has, the UN has rendered this constitutional law to be a violation of human rights based on international standards for the rights of reproductive health of women, adolescents, and girls, and that this policy has irreparable consequences for women that may constitute a form of torture and ill treatment by the state. Honduras is also home to a sexual violence epidemic, and it's been labeled one of the most dangerous places on the earth for a woman to live in. And violent crime in general has been a topic of public interest in Honduras for many years, and contributes to the migrant crisis of Honduran refugees fleeing the country. So furthermore, banning access is a hindrance to further development in the country and for the safety of women. So briefly, I'll address what I've gathered based on the Garifuna population of Honduras. And for the current state of affairs of Garifuna people, despite having a long-standing historical legacy of erasure and displacement, they are still alive and well, and there is a thriving community of Garifunas in Honduras. And the ethnic disparities that are faced by them make them more susceptible to not having enough access to reproductive resources. And there are a variety of feminists, that'll bring me to my next point, which is some of the feminist organizations in Honduras. One of the primary ones that I looked into is Somos Muchas, and they are dedicated to providing access to adequate healthcare and reproductive health healthcare to Garifuna women, women of color, and low-income women in Honduras. And finally, there's the election of Xiomara Castro. She was the first woman to be elected to be the president of Honduras in December 2021. And women's rights campaigners across the region are hoping that Castro can push her campaign pledge to increase access to abortion. She's also the first president of Honduras to not be associated with either party. She's a democratic socialist and has not been associated with either the National Party and the Liberal Party. And she has spoken to Somos Muchas and some other feminist collectives in the country and promised to legalize abortions and stay true to some of the demands that were made by other feminist organizations in Honduras. I think that's my time.
Thank you so much, Maya. The next we'll have the soon-to-be Dr. Lenear and Dr. Matos Daly.
Hi, I'm India Lenear. I'm a second year at Rutgers in the Women in Politics program. And this is a co-authored paper with Dr. Matos Daly It's entitled Black Women's Attitudes on Immigration. And basically this project came about from our class reading of Dr. Neon B. Carter's American While Black. And we had a rich conversation about what this means, how does this change, how does this change how we understand Black public opinion, basically, and particularly when we're using the example or the topic of immigration. And basically, we wanted to make a clearer gender intervention in the argument that Dr. Carter makes in American While Black, which brought us to our paper. So first, just to give a summary of our paper, or introduction to our paper. But basically, we present that because Black women are generally going to hold positions and identities that lead them to have more progressive and liberal attitudes towards other people, other populations, and in particular politics, then we are divergent from Dr. Carter's theory of conflicted nativism and purport this idea that Black women's identification with a woman of color political identity is going to be a stronger pull and tie for understanding immigration-based attitudes. And we have four hypotheses where we say that first, Black women will be more likely to have more positive attitudes towards immigrants due to holding a Black woman intersectional political identity or woman of color identity informed by the Combahee River Collective compared to Black men. Our second hypothesis is Black women will be more likely to have a more positive attitudes towards inclusive immigration policies because of their women of color, Black woman intersectional political identity compared to Black men. Our other two hypotheses are looking towards how Black women, how their attitudes are shaped and the variation of if they're more positive towards holding a woman of color social and political identity compared to Black men. In particular, these two hypotheses are looking we're looking to see how they ID compared to Black woman identity and no woman of color identity. So we're really just trying to grapple with that part. So for our data and methods, we're using the CNPS data from the 2016 CNPS and the 2021 CNPS data. And we basically are finding that Black women generally are more liberal and progressive with their immigration attitudes, specifically identifying with a Black woman ID from the 2016 CNPS data that Black women are more likely is a strong predictor for having liberal and progressive attitudes on immigration policies in comparison to Black men. And while Black men also are showing progressive attitudes, there is some room for there is some difference. There's a divergence of Black women being more progressive than Black men. The Black men are progressive, but they're not as progressive as Black men. I think that's the point that we're trying to get to. Dr. Matos, did you want to add in some more for the?
Yeah, since we had such a little, such lots of paper and not so much time, we just decided not to go with slides. But that was sort of the general gist. We really wanted, or we really thought that the conflicted nativism theory was almost a little bit masculine, and that there was little conversation or space to understand a lot of what we know about Black women, right? We understand a lot about Black women elites as being one of the most inclusive communities. Like if we look at Congress, for example, Black women, like the work of Nadia Brown and Gershon, right? That Black women often have politics and policy that are the most inclusive of all different kinds of communities, not just for the Black community or for Black women. And so we thought that was really interesting, and we wanted to understand Black women's attitudes on immigration. And at bottom, that's what we found. Black women are, due to their Black women identity, which we measured by like Black women linked fade, and a woman of color identity, which we also measured by, do they identify as women of color? And we used a few data sets on that they hold more, that Black women who identify with a woman of color identity hold even more progressive immigration attitudes towards immigrants and immigration policy. So we'll leave it there so we can have a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you both so very much. I'm really excited about this paper. All right, so we're going to move on to Dr. Riley and Dr. Peterson, I believe. So I'm going to remove pins and move other pins. Thank you, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Riley. Take it away.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So we are actually going to end up doing your presentation, but we'll definitely make it quick. Not try, we'll make it quick.
And I'll go ahead on and get started, Clarissa, while you're pulling it up. This presentation is part of our forthcoming book, chapter 3, where we examine racial attitudes among Hispanics and Asians. And we entitle this chapter, Clash of American and Racial Identity. As we think about America becoming more diverse as a democracy, as we think about the shrinking white population that's happening across the United States, there is a need for minorities to consider the degree to which multiracial coalitions will be important for forming policy, for getting things done. And so part of that is also happening in the backdrop of a society that is inherently anti-Black, that has inherently racist as well. And so if we think about incidents like, you can go to the next slide, if we think about incidents like the January 6th insurrection, when we look at the racial composition of this particular movement, we saw people who were white, people who were white passing, we saw Hispanics. And so there's been this conversation about multiracial whiteness and the way in which whiteness now operates as an identity where groups could take on similar behaviors. We don't test that directly, but what we are specifically looking at in this chapter is the degree to which racial attitudes exist among Hispanics and Asians. And so if we begin to examine much of the previous scholarship and literature on this topic, much of the scholarship has centered whites. We haven't really gotten into really uncovering the nuances of these attitudes among other racial groups that exist in the US. And so we draw off of the three theoretical models that you saw, such as group contact thesis, shared interest thesis, and group conflict. As we think about Hispanics and Black people sharing spaces, right, there's the general expectation that as they share spaces and have increased interaction, there's likely to be a congruence of attitudes, but we simply haven't had these attitudes studied in any type of systematic way. And so we take up this important work in this chapter of the book by looking at the degree to which, you can go to the next slide, the degree to which these attitudes exist. We know from previous scholarship that racial attitudes on white attitudes exist when it comes to political behavior, when it comes to political outcomes, when it comes to predicting attitudes about public policy, and a host of number of issues. We also know that we say that expected to have similar, yet a nuanced influence on attitudes of other groups. So do these attitudes exist among these other groups? And if so, what are the nuances that make these attitudes potent among other groups? And this is the work we take up in this chapter. And we sort of move from plotting racial prejudice to racial resentment and seeing whether or not it has an influence on policy preferences among these groups as well. There are some other differences when we think about cultural differences as well that we get to in more detail in the chapter. You can go to the next slide.
Okay,
you go.
I'm sorry. So generally speaking, our research question is, how do racial attitudes and group identity impact feelings toward perceived Black organizations and issues? And I'm going to speed through this, so I apologize ahead of time, and please just ask questions later. First off, we wanted to cover the terrain that's been covered in terms of the impact of attitudes toward race on politics. And so we started with looking at prejudice, right? So what do we see with prejudice among these various groups? What you should take away from this, so this measures whether people think Black people are lazy. And it's a measure that goes from 1 to 7. And the only thing to really come away with is that everybody has some level of prejudice against Black people when it comes to thinking Black people are lazy. And that when we look at Hispanics and Asians, and by the way, we use Hispanics because this is the language that's used in the data set. And so we're just consistent with what the data sets use, how they classify people. So at any rate, they're all, they have more prejudice than whites when it comes to that. Some people will say, okay, what really matters is, you know, we all have prejudice. So how does my prejudice against my group differ from my prejudice against Black people? So the real measure of prejudice is the difference between how prejudiced I am against them versus my own group. And we see here that Asians, in looking at 2016, but also in looking at 2000, Asians have the most prejudice against Black people. And when you compare that to how they feel about their own group. When you look at another measure of prejudice, which is both lazy but also violent, again, this goes from 1 to 14, we see everybody has prejudice, high prejudice against Black people. And for whites is 8.17, Asians, and Hispanic and Asians are very close to that. Asians have the highest prejudice against Black people. And again, looking at the difference, we see the difference between how they view themselves and how they view Black people for Asians is the highest. There's a 4-point difference between the prejudice they have against Black people versus themselves. So the more recent measures are about racial resentment. And Jasmine, if you can remind me of like time, when it's almost time, like put up some numbers or something, okay, sorry. So when we look at racial resentment, we see a similar thing, right? Everybody has racial resentment against Black people. This is using the 4 measures that we always see that measure racial resentment. So here, all groups have racial resentment, although whites tend to have more racial resentment than other groups. So this just looks at the mean racial resentment for groups. And the only thing I want to highlight here is that when you look at those who say race is important to them, you see a difference between whites and other groups. So what does this mean? Those who are white say race is important have higher racial resentment, yet Asians and Hispanics who say race is important have lower racial resentment. So this means then that identity is playing a different nuanced role with Asians and Hispanics versus with whites, right? We can't really tease it out in just this kind of data, but we'll do more rigorous testing in what comes along. And so this is basically the hypothesis, just trying to understand how this plays into how these groups feel about issues that are explicitly racist or deal with race and issues that implicitly use race. So for the implicit use, we're looking at feelings toward healthcare. Most of the literature says that healthcare became racialized under Obama. And so we wanted to look at how these groups feel about healthcare and what role racial attitudes played in that versus other things. And then the explicit thing is Black Lives Matter. And we use ordinal regression for healthcare because it's an ordinal measure, ordinary least squares for Black Lives Matter because it isn't ordinal. So I'm skipping ahead to just the regression. And now what's important here this is for Hispanics in the years 2011, 16, and 19. What we see here is it is important what they think about race. So if race is important to them, they are more likely to say that healthcare should be a public concern. It's not a private concern. That's what the positive number means here. And that racial resentment is always important, right? Racial resentment is always significant. This means that those who have the least racial resentment are also the people who say it's a public thing. Healthcare should be dealt with in the public sphere. For Asians, we don't see much with identity measures with the exception of 2011. But with Asians, we see the traditional political measures, ideology, and political parties matter, right? And this is why, I don't know if you were able to catch it, but our hypothesis about Asians wasn't really that we didn't really expect to see the same type of identity connection with Asians that we anticipated with Hispanics, and we can tell you more about that if you guys ask later. And toward Black Lives Matter, what do we see? Once again, at least a measure of linked fate. Dealing with identity for Latinos is important for determining how Latinos or Hispanics in this case feel about Black Lives Matter, and racial resentment. For Asians, racial resentment, but also a more political variable of a political party. So just generally speaking, and this is the part I want to get to, I'm so sorry, Jasmine, I'm trying to fly it through. Racial resentment is a powerful predictor of attitudes toward explicit and implicit racial issues and groups, right? We see that it's always significant and it influences it in the directions that we expect when it comes to healthcare attitudes and when it comes to attitudes toward Black Lives Matter. The nuance that Emmett talked about was we have to start understanding, though, that there's a difference between how these racial attitudes impact whites and how they impact other marginalized groups, given the context of what we read about group conflict theory and other things, right? The contact thesis, et cetera. And for Hispanics, it seems like whenever they feel a closeness to other people who are Hispanic, they have a greater sympathy for Black people and are more supportive of issues that have been implicitly or explicitly tied to Black people. This same type of pattern doesn't exist with Asians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Riley. That was wonderful. And there's going to be a lot of conversation, I think, over the last two panels, absolutely, for sure. So Dr. Tamelyn Tucker-Worgs, you're up next.
Okay.
Emmett can just stop sharing. I'm sure he'll do that for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Okay. I'm also going to be really quick, but I do need some help, Jasmine, so you can put that bell on for me or whatever if I start going too long. Okay. All right. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for being here. We're going to talk today. I'm going to give a brief discussion about some research that Tucker-Worgs and I are working on, and the project is called Theology and Politics. Is it not coming up? Examining the relationship between Black theology, the prosperity gospel, and Black political attitudes and behavior. And it's part of a larger project that we're working on about morality in politics. We're thinking about ideas, morality, and moral ideas and theological ideas that drive and organize Black politics. We're also using, oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, we're also using the collaborative multiracial post-election survey for this project, and looking at some of that data where we asked, well, one of the questions we asked was about prosperity, about the prosperity gospel, and also about Black theology. And so many studies that look at Black churches and their politics mostly look at kind of like religiosity factors like church attendance, and then also the organizational resources. And again, we're going to look at the ways in which theology and ideas and theological orientations may guide, political behavior and also political attitudes. And so first, I want to start very briefly with a discussion about Black theology and what it is. And how it might, what some studies have shown already about what it does for politics. And so just the concept of Black theology is a kind of theological orientation, a study of systematic theology that kind of comes out of the 1960s, comes out of the Black Power era, and has these particular tenets. One is that Christianity basically should be interpreted from a Black perspective that challenges racism and recognizes kind of African connections and African heritage. It's also in Black theology, the world should be changed. Those who are the believers, the body of the church should work to change the world to reflect the vantage point of the least of these. And there's also concern about the least of these. Also, and that the gospel demands liberation of the oppressed, that this is what people should be working towards. And then also in the Black theology, Jesus Christ is depicted as Black. And this is not only about skin color, or not even always, for some theologians, I'm not going to get into this, but it's not about skin color, but more about connecting Christ to the Black freedom struggle. We'll leave it there. And so some findings, or some of the kind of literature about Black theology and politics, is mostly uses the idea, that last component that I mentioned about Jesus as being Black. And so using that kind of measure when we're talking about some of the quantitative work, the studies show that there is a connection between kind of the image of Christ as Black and political attitudes and behavior. And even on the individual level, but also on the church level. Like, for example, in my own research about Black megachurches, I found that these churches whose main primary theological orientation was Black theology, they were most likely to, and more likely than other churches that didn't have that as their primary orientation, to engage in things like having a social and political concerns ministry, a standing committee, or ministry for social and political concerns, also engaging in housing development and community development. And so we see there is that relationship, both on the individual level as well as churches, the institutions. And so when we looked at the CMKS data, there was a question there. And the question was, when you speak or think of Christ, do you imagine Christ as being, and there are these choices, Black? Do you imagine Christ as being white? Do you imagine another race? Or do you not see Christ as any particular race? And so you see here from the table that most of the respondents, and this was, I think, 4,600 and something respondents, said that they didn't see Christ as, all Black respondents, said that they didn't see Christ as any particular race. And then the next highest is Black, and then another race, and then white, 6%. Okay, so when we thought we should look at this by gender, and see kind of what does this look like as far as how people imagined Christ by gender. And so this is what we found, which I thought was interesting. But that when you look at, for Black men, for 30% of Black men imagined Christ as Black, and while 23% of Black women did. For white, 10% of Black men imagined Christ, a white Christ, and 7% men. And then another race, 12% men and 9.5% women. These are all Black respondents, and also non-binary, 36%, another race. And then I don't see Christ as any particular race. Still, this one is by far, but I thought it was really interesting, this men-women difference for not seeing Christ as a particular race, where there was 49% who didn't see Christ as a race, but 61% women who didn't see Christ as any particular race. Okay. So then we were looking at party ID. We ran a lot of things, but these were some of the ones that we thought, these are crosstabs that we thought were interesting. And this is just really, we're just scratching the surface, really just trying to describe it and see what we see before we ask more further, deeper questions and do some deeper analysis. But when it comes to Republican and Democrat and Independent, for seeing a Black Christ, 7% of those who say Christ is Black were Republican, 69% were Democrat, and then you see, and so on. Okay, then we were asking looked at the behavior measure about Black Lives Matter. And so when the survey asked the respondents whether or not they participated in any Black Lives Matter protests, I think was in the last year, this is when we saw something interesting, a relationship. And so that as far as the ones who saw a Black Jesus, we changed the variable so that we just had one variable, everyone who said they saw Black Jesus, and then we put in the other variable all the other people who said white, didn't see a color, like that. And so we saw that of those who participated in Black Lives Matter protests, and so that would be the yes category. There's 31% of them saw Black Jesus. And then for no, 68%. And then for those who didn't see a Black Jesus, 17%, and then 80% no, 83%. So we thought that was interesting. Okay, so for the next one, about the gospel of prosperity, this is another important, I guess, movement, 21st century movement of a theological movement, not just in Black churches, but period. And so basically the prosperity gospel says that if you are faithful, God will reward you. God rewards the faithful with health and wealth. And interestingly, kind of like on the other hand, at least for the churches that I researched looking at the Black mega churches, the kind of argument was that if you are not healthy or don't have wealth, then the kind of response to that was that you need to have more faith. You need to increase your faith. That increasing your faith is the response, is the remedy for lack of health and lack of wealth. And so this letter, you can't see it because it's blurry and small, but basically it is a letter requesting from one of my mega churches in Houston, requesting funding for support for their aviation ministry. And so that if you would give to this ministry, you would see your own self blessed with your own transportation needs. And I just thought it was an interesting kind of example of really a prosperity church where prosperity is kind of like the primary theological orientation. However, this prosperity gospel goes beyond those who are just where prosperity is the primary kind of theological orientation. It's really kind of ubiquitous throughout many different church traditions and church forms, not just mega churches. And so that's something else. So as far as the gospel of prosperity in politics, most of what people have found so far in the literature is that there's not a lot there, but that the prosperity gospel kind of dampens political participation. Because what it basically says is that politics is not the answer to our problems. Instead, faith is. And so it doesn't really encourage political participation, although there are some studies that kind of show it encouraging some conservative political participation. We could talk about that later, some studies that I was reading about that. So when we looked at the question, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? This was the question on the survey about the prosperity gospel. God will reward the faithful with health and wealth. And to what extent do you agree with that? And so when we looked at the responses, this was interesting. I was kind of surprised, but that Blacks here are highlighted in red, Black people, and this one was asked of the whole data set. Really, for the most part, when we look at the total agree, and total disagree, for Black respondents, almost 70% of them agree with this statement that is consistent with the prosperity gospel, that God will reward the faithful with health and wealth. And so that was interesting. And particularly when you compare it to the other racial groups like whites and Latinos and Asians. Blacks were more likely to agree with that statement and be consistent, which is consistent with the prosperity gospel or prosperity beliefs. And so then we asked about, we looked at the response about Black Lives Matter, and found that there was actually no relationship between those who agreed with the prosperity gospel and didn't agree with the prosperity gospel. So, and whether or not they participated in Black Lives Matter protests. So for those who said, yes, they participated in Black Lives Matter protests, there's that 19%, no, they don't agree with the prosperity gospel. And then 18%, yes, they do agree with the prosperity. So that's very close. So there was not there was no statistical significance there. So, okay. So in conclusion, this is not really a conclusion. It's like in the spirit of more questions. Black theology, or about Christ seems to matter when it comes to Black Lives Matter protests, but the prosperity gospel does not. And so we're just thinking about all kinds of things like, does that measure or discussion about the prosperity gospel, that question, does it really measure the prosperity gospel? I mean, even though it's really, that's like the main tenet that God rewards the faithful with health and wealth, but does it mean that God punishes those who are not faithful? Like, does it mean that converse meaning? Are people taking it that way? And so just to really think about the prosperity gospel and getting into some of the nuance of it and just asking more questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker-Worgs. So it looks like we have just over 15 minutes for a discussion, and I wanted to pivot to the audience to first ask questions. From the papers I received, I will be sending you guys some feedback personally, but given time, I wanted to make sure that we pivot to the audience for any questions they may have first. So anyone from the audience like to ask a question? Or of course, panelists ask questions to everybody else.
I did have a question for Dr. Peterson and Riley about race, and I put this in the chat as well, but I wondered how you're conceptualizing what is race for pan-ethnic groups like Latinos and Asians? Like when you say like their race means a lot to them, is that their ethnicity? Is that like what was the question about race? And is there, like, I wonder what's the theorization between race and ethnicity, and they're obviously two different things. And so is it race, or is it like whether they think they're racialized?
Right. So we're using it in two different ways. One of them is identification, which is the classic question on whether it's the GSS, the ANES, the YouGov survey, the MBES, the MBPS, et cetera, right? Which is, how do you classify yourself? Do you consider yourselves Black? Do you consider yourself Asian, et cetera? And as you may know, the numbers are pretty low on many of those surveys. But so that's one thing. How do they identify? But then there are questions about how important race is to them. So that's a different measure, which is, there's a question that asks, how important is your race to you? And if they said it's extremely important or important, they get 1 score versus if they don't. There's another question for identity that looks at linked faith, right? Looking at the scholarship that says linked faith is important for some groups versus others. And the same thing, there's scholarship that talks about whether race is important to them and how they act if race is important to them. And then lastly, there's a question, I gotta go back to my PowerPoint. I think there's one other measure that we're looking at for, what race means to them. And then racial resentment, again, is that the 4 measures asking how they feel about Black people. And so there are various measures of racial identity that we tap into, given the literature on what we say the impact, or how racial identity impacts other things, but also how racial attitudes impact other things, if that makes sense to you.
I guess my question was, given that Latinos are racially diverse, right? So when you ask what does race means to me, I'm answering as a Black Latina, but I'm not answering as a Latina, just a Latina, right? And so how do you decipher what people mean when you ask them a question about race, or like, you know, like, yeah, I guess even with Asians, right? That they're sort of like, when it comes to skin color, there's a difference, right? When it comes to like level, the hierarchy within Asian American society.
Exactly. So the standard questions in the American National Election Studies, the GSS and others, there's a specific question that asks, what do you consider yourself? More recently, they have allowed that to be more diverse. So you can say, I consider myself from Vietnamese. I consider myself Korean, you know, whatever group. But there's a standard question that is asked that is, again, it's not tapping into, that question in particular is not tapping into how strong that is. That is just asking who you are, what you consider yourself. Now, there's a separate measure which asks how strong your racial group is to you. So if you say, I consider myself to be Black, the follow-up question to that is, how important is being Black to you? So it depends on what survey you're talking about and what specific measure you're talking about. So you're absolutely right. So I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying. I'm just saying that there's a standard body of literature that addresses how these play out and the impact that they have on the attitudes toward policies, organizations, et cetera, that people from these groups have. But it's much more complex. I understand your point. It's much, much more complex than we're making it. And our book, if I can plug our book, actually addresses that in the first chapter, that this is a much more complex argument or conversation that needs to be had. So we're just scratching the surface of it and just saying, even at this level, you can see that models that explain white behavior aren't that great at explaining what happens when groups are either experiencing conflict between each other in the same communities, or when they have a shared interest, or when they have both been marginalized, et cetera. That those models that talk about white behavior aren't good for talking about these particular groups as well.
And if I may add to that really, really quickly, I think the story here is that even among the Hispanic and Latinos that we have in the sample, those who say that their race is important are more typically aligned with racialized issues that support the community. And one theoretical explanation for that is the shared sense of oppression. The new CCE, the new data coming out of UCLA will allow us to disaggregate by the diversity that exists within the Latino community. So for example, Cubans tend to be more conservative. And I would imagine intuitively, those individuals wouldn't suggest that their racial identity is important. The other component of this is those Latinos and Hispanics and even Asians who saw their American identity before their racial identity were more likely to exemplify conservative practices that resembled whites, as opposed to those who responded to the question that saw their racial identity is important to them. That was another, so it's sort of this clash between racial identity, however the respondent may be interpreting that, and also the question about their Americanness and what there's even questions about this color blindness that exists in society as well. And so I think that those are the two sort of the complications here that needs to be that we do unpack to.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience or panelists before I jump in for some other questions? Okay, so two comments I want to make, and of course, if people have questions, feel free to raise your hands, let me know. I'm going to start with Maya's paper and Tamelyn and Donn's paper. One of the things that I actually see as a crossover here is this question of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism as a political structure follows suit with these kind of questions of individual responsibility as part and parcel of the political fabric within the communities that you're thinking of. And what I mean by this is the abortion, when we think about abortion bans, a lot of them, whether it's in the United States and Latin America or elsewhere, a lot of the arguments that are made push the responsibility back to people having sex. So it's you did something, you are now responsible for working through it. I think there's some interesting questions here about neoliberalism and the prosperity gospel as well. So I was wondering if each of you, Maya and Tamelyn, could think about how neoliberalism informs some of the questions that you're thinking through or could help frame that. Going back to Clarissa and Emmitt's chapter and Jalinda and India's piece as well. I think that one of the questions that's coming around here is this: what do we mean by nativism, right? So I know that India and Yalidy, thank you, Yalidy's paper is really thinking about pushing back on Naomi Carter's work, which is about nativism. So how are you guys approaching the question of nativism? How are you defining it? Are you just defining it using the same definition or not? Does it actually change? And the conversation that I just saw there when Emmitt was talking about Americanness, is that also part of this question of nativism? And I'm really thinking through Claire Jean Kim's work on racial triangulation here, right? How does Claire Jean Kim's analysis inform or could help inform these more tensions between, are we talking about race? Are we talking about ethnicity? Are we talking about this other thing that is like this kind of creed question around nationalism? So those are the two sets of questions that I have for the two papers. And there might be a neoliberalism there too, because even Claire Jean Kim is working through that analysis as well. So whoever would like to start, feel free to jump in. Tamelyn, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Jasmine, for that question. I think, yes, neoliberalism does kind of inform a discussion about the prosperity gospel. And so one of the things we were looking for, or have begun to look for, is how this measure might correlate with other kind of measures that point towards personal responsibility, or even certain ideas like political ideology or partisanship. But so far, what we saw just very quickly, it does not correlate. So we did one about the moderate conservative scale. It didn't have anything to do with the prosperity gospel question. It just seemed like this prosperity gospel question, and I don't know if it's really measuring the prosperity gospel, that's the other thing, but the question is, the people agree with that. I mean, there's this kind of strong agreement with that idea that I'm not sure is really is taking on the whole idea that what you're pointing to with the neoliberalism, like it's your responsibility. So just because someone is saying that health and wealth, that God rewards the faithful with health and wealth, I'm not sure if they're also saying, it's your fault or you are responsible for not having health and wealth, I guess. So I'm just not sure if it's really, if these people would really agree with that. So I guess that's where we are. I don't know.
Thank you.
Didn't get to go. Oh, I'm sorry.
Riley, Emmitt, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Okay, I was saying that the student go. I want the student to go if they haven't. So,
Maya, did you want to take a stab at that, or do you want to think about it a little bit longer?
I'm still thinking about it a little bit. If somebody else wants to jump in.
That's fair.
Yeah. So what I will say is, I think that we're at an interesting place in American politics. And while we are a democracy that comprises of different racial groups, we are at a period where people experience race differently. And the social construction of race has changed, also coupled with this identity politics that's happening. And so in this chapter, we hope to, at least we uncover the extent to which, we think about, we bring groups here and we want everybody to assimilate into American culture. Well, as you assimilate into that American culture and you start to place American identity above your racial identity, then what we see happening is a movement more towards white political behavior in terms of having negative racial attitudes that are predictive of policy preferences. And so at least as I'm thinking about this, at least as the way I'm thinking about this chapter, I think that it speaks to the extent to which you have these two identities. And Du Bois talks about this, but in The Souls of Black Folk, right? You know, two souls with unreconcilable strivings between two worlds. And so oftentimes what we see happening is this struggle, this internal struggle among groups. And also the implications of this suggest that if groups are to form successful multiracial coalitions, it will have to be with groups who see their shared identity as linked with other minorities who suffered a shared sense of oppression. And of course, there are data limitations, especially as we talk about racial and ethnic minorities, which is what researchers are trying to overcome, because it is a real issue with how groups are, how immigrants are socialized here, whether they're first generation, second generation, or whatever area they come from, that you're likely to see differences in the political behavior of these particular groups. And so uncovering those nuances are certainly important to having better explanatory power about how these groups are experiencing the world and the way in which they even see or don't see race as operating, you know, and in a traditional sense. So that's what I respond. At least that's my response to sort of the question in a very quick way.
Thank you.
I wanted to respond to what you were saying about, you know, this the crossing paths of like reproductive rights and also neoliberalism. And I think I was taking so long to formulate a response because I feel like there's so many contradictions that are apparent where, you know, under neoliberalism, there's this enforcement of individual choice and individual freedom, and then, you know, kind of this packaged up version of what empowerment is supposed to be. But then there is so much, you know, pressure and control from the state, particularly when it comes to what women and people can do with their bodies, and the type of access that they have to have healthy bodies. So I think it's a little bit contradictory that, you know, there's always this discourse of individualism, and it doesn't follow through with what the state wants, and it only kind of does for a short period of time. So that's just what was on my mind about this.
Thank you, thank you. A couple more minutes, so whoever would like to take any other questions, or if not, we can go ahead and close early. I know it's been a long conference for everybody, and I know that Dr. Tucker-Worgs had to jump off again, but thank you so much. And I look forward to sending you guys some comments and some other aspects to the work. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.